December 8th, 1980. A cold Monday night in New York City. The sidewalk outside the Dakota apartment building on West 72nd Street was mostly empty. Inside the ornate entrance, a doorman shuffled paperwork at his desk. Across the street, in the shadows, a pudgy young man clutched a paperback copy of The Catcher in the Rye and waited. At 10:50 p.m., a limousine pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and out stepped John Lennon, wearing jeans and a leather jacket, his round glasses catching the streetlight. Beside him was Yoko Ono, dressed in black. They'd just come from the recording studio, working late into the night. John was happy. After 5 years away from music, after 5 years devoted to raising his son, he was back. His new album, Double Fantasy, was climbing the charts. At 40 years old, he finally felt at peace. He never heard the gunshots. 5 bullets. 4 hit their target. John Lennon staggered up the steps of the Dakota, blood spreading across his chest, and collapsed in the doorway. "I'm shot," he told the doorman, his voice barely a whisper. By the time the police arrived, by the time they rushed him to Roosevelt Hospital, it was too late. At 11:07 p.m., 17 minutes after the shooting, John Winston Lennon was pronounced dead. The man who'd asked us to imagine a world without war, without borders, without heaven or hell, the man who'd given his whole life to the dream of peace, was gone, murdered by a stranger who wanted to be famous. How did the boy from Liverpool who changed music forever end up here, bleeding on a New York sidewalk? Welcome to Story Factory. I'm here to revisit the lives of the legends who shaped our memories, the voices that filled our transistor radios, the faces that made us believe anything was possible. Today, we're opening the story of John Lennon in the tragic final chapter of the Beatle who gave us Imagine. This isn't just a story about music. It's a story about a boy who lost his mother twice, about fame that became a prison, about a love so controversial it nearly destroyed him, and about a man who spent his whole life searching for peace but could never quite find it, until it was too late. Let's go back to where it all began. Liverpool, England, 1940. The city was burning. German bombers flew over the Mersey River night after night, dropping their payloads on factories, docks, and neighborhoods. In a small house on Newcastle Road, a woman named Julia Lennon gave birth to a baby boy on October 9th, right in the middle of an air raid. The sirens wailed, the bombs fell, and John Winston Lennon came screaming into a world at war. His father, Alfred, was a merchant seaman who was rarely home. His mother, Julia, was young, pretty, and restless, the kind of woman who played the banjo and told jokes and didn't quite fit the mold of 1940s motherhood. When John was 5, Alfred came home from sea and demanded Julia choose: come away with him or stay in Liverpool. Julia chose Liverpool, but she didn't choose John. Instead, John went to live with his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George in a tidy house on Menlove Avenue. Mimi was strict, proper, deeply respectable. She raised John with rules and expectations. But every so often, Julia would breeze through the door, all laughter and music, and take John to the park or play him records on the gramophone. Then she'd disappear again, leaving John confused, angry, abandoned. That abandonment would haunt him his whole life. At Quarrybank High School, John was bright but difficult. He drew obscene cartoons, wrote satirical poems, mocked the teachers. He formed a skiffle group with his friends and named them the Quarrymen, after the school. They played washboards and tea-chest bass and simple 3-chord songs. It was 1956, and rock and roll had just arrived in England. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. The music was wild, sexual, dangerous, and John Lennon wanted in. On July 6, 1957, the Quarrymen played at a church garden party in Woolton. In the audience stood a baby-faced 15-year-old named Paul McCartney. Paul could play guitar, he could sing, and when he showed John how to tune a guitar properly, how to play 20 Flight Rock, note for note, John saw something: competition, talent, a partner. He invited Paul to join the band. It was the beginning of the most important creative partnership in music history. Paul brought in his friend George Harrison, a skinny kid with slicked back hair who could play guitar better than any of them. They played dingy clubs in Liverpool. then seedy bars in Hamburg, Germany, where they learned to perform for 8 hours a night, fueled by speed and beer. They were raw, loud, dangerous. And slowly they were becoming great. His mother, Julia, the woman he'd lost as a child but had slowly reconnected with as a teenager, was hit by a car driven by an off-duty police officer. She died instantly. John was 17. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't talk about it. He buried the pain so deep it would take decades to surface. But from that moment on, John Lennon had a hole in his heart that nothing, not fame, not love, not music, could ever quite fill. The Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, came out in October 1962. It was a modest hit. Their second, Please Please Me, went to #1. And then, in 1963, everything exploded. Beatlemania. You remember it, don't you? The screaming girls, the mop-top haircuts, the matching suits. Everywhere the Beatles went, thousands of teenagers mobbed them. Train stations, airports, hotels, it didn't matter. The screams were so loud you couldn't hear the music. John, Paul, George, and Ringo became the biggest thing in the world almost overnight. In February 1964, they arrived in America. 73 million people watched them on The Ed Sullivan Show. They played Shea Stadium to 55,000 fans. They made movies. They met presidents. They were everywhere all at once, and the world couldn't get enough. But for John, the thrill faded fast. He was married to his college girlfriend, Cynthia, and they had a son, Julian, born in 1963. But John was never home. He was on planes, in hotels, in screaming stadiums, where he couldn't even hear himself sing. The fame was suffocating. The expectations were crushing. And the music was starting to feel like a product, not art. By 1966, John was exhausted. The Beatles stopped touring. They retreated to the recording studio and began to experiment. Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The music became deeper, stranger, more ambitious. John started writing songs that weren't about holding hands anymore. Help was a genuine cry for support. Strawberry Fields Forever was a dreamlike meditation on childhood and confusion. A Day in the Life was a haunting masterpiece about numbness and disconnection. John Lennon was one of the most famous men on earth, and he was falling apart. Then in November 1966, he walked into an art gallery in London. There was an exhibit by a Japanese avant-garde artist named Yoko Ono. One piece invited viewers to hammer a nail into a white canvas. Another was a ladder leading to the ceiling with a magnifying glass hanging from a chain. John climbed the ladder. He looked through the magnifying glass at a tiny word written on the ceiling. Yes. It was the first positive message he'd seen in an art gallery in years. He was intrigued. He met Yoko. They talked. And slowly, quietly, John Lennon fell in love. The world hated it. Yoko was 7 years older than John. She was Japanese. She was an artist, not a pop star. She dressed in black, spoke in riddles, made strange experimental music. The British press called her the woman who broke up the Beatles. Fans sent her death threats. Even Paul, George, and Ringo resented her presence in the studio, sitting beside John during recording sessions like a shadow. But John didn't care. For the first time in his life, he'd found someone who understood him. Yoko didn't want him because he was a Beatle. She wanted him because he was John. She challenged him, pushed him, made him think differently about art and music and life. In 1969, John divorced Cynthia and married Yoko in Gibraltar. They spent their honeymoon in bed at the Amsterdam Hilton, inviting the press to photograph them as a protest for peace. Make love, not war, they said. The world thought they were crazy. The Beatles released their final album, Let It Be, in 1970, but the band had already fractured. John wanted to move forward with Yoko. Paul wanted to stay in control. George wanted respect. Ringo just wanted everyone to get along. In April 1970, Paul announced he was leaving the Beatles. Officially, the greatest band in history was over. The press blamed Yoko. The fans blamed Yoko. Even decades later, people would say she destroyed the Beatles. But the truth was more complicated. The Beatles were 4 working-class boys from Liverpool who'd conquered the world before they turned 30. They'd lived inside a pressure cooker for 8 years. They were bound to break. Yoko didn't destroy the Beatles. She just happened to be there when it all fell apart. John didn't mourn the band's end. He felt free. In 1971, he released Imagine, a solo album that would become his masterpiece. The title track, written in his white piano room at Tittenhurst Park, was a simple plea for a better world. No countries, no possessions, no religion, nothing to kill or die for. Just imagine. It became an anthem. It still is. At weddings and funerals, at protests and memorials. Imagine plays on. A reminder of what John believed. That people, if they tried, could make the world a kinder place. But John's own world was growing darker. He and Yoko moved to New York City in 1971, settling into the Dakota, a Gothic apartment building overlooking Central Park. John loved New York. It was gritty, anonymous, alive. But the U.S. government didn't love him. The FBI, under orders from President Nixon, began surveillance on John, trying to deport him for his anti-war activism. For years, John fought to stay in America, attending hearings, hiring lawyers, living under constant watch. It was paranoia made real. In 1973, John and Yoko separated. John spent 18 months in Los Angeles in what he later called his lost weekend, a blur of drinking, partying, and self-destruction. He produced albums for other artists, recorded his own music, but mostly he drifted, lost without Yoko's grounding presence. In 1975, they reconciled. That same year, Yoko gave birth to their son, Sean, and John made a decision that shocked the world. He retired from music. For 5 years, John Lennon didn't record a single song. He didn't give interviews. He didn't perform. Instead, he stayed home at the Dakota, devoted entirely to raising Sean. He took his son to the park, read him stories, was there for every milestone. The world was stunned. Here was one of the most famous musicians on earth, choosing fatherhood over fame. But John was finally doing what he'd always wanted, being present, being a father, trying to be the parent his own parents had never been. Those 5 years, he would later say, were the happiest of his life. But by 1980, he was ready to come back. He and Yoko recorded Double Fantasy, an album about their relationship, their struggles, their love. It was honest, vulnerable, hopeful. John gave interviews, appeared on the radio, smiled for the cameras. He talked about how much he'd changed, how much he'd grown. "I'm 40 years old," he said. "I'm just beginning." On December 8, 1980, John and Yoko spent the afternoon at the Hit Factory recording studio, working on Yoko's song, Walking on Thin Ice. Around 5 p.m., they left the building. Outside, a young man named Mark David Chapman approached with a copy of Double Fantasy and asked John to sign it. John signed it, smiled, and got into his limousine. Chapman stayed. He waited. And when John returned that night, Chapman fired 5 shots from a .38 revolver. The news spread instantly. Radio stations interrupted their programming. DJs wept on air. In New York, crowds gathered outside the Dakota, holding candles, singing Imagine and Give Peace a Chance. Around the world, people who'd grown up with the Beatles, who danced to Twist and Shout and cried to In My Life, tried to make sense of the senseless. John Lennon, the man who'd preached peace his whole life, had been murdered. Yoko released a statement. John loved and prayed for the human race. Please do the same for him. Mark Chapman, when arrested, said he'd killed John because he wanted to be famous. He'd been inspired by The Catcher in the Rye, a novel about alienation and phoniness. He thought John Lennon was a phony, rich, famous, preaching about no possessions while living in the Dakota. It was twisted logic. It was madness. And it took one of the greatest artists of the 20th century away from us forever. John Lennon never got to see his son Sean grow up. He never got to make another album. He never got to be an old man, reflecting on his legacy, making peace with his past. He was 40 years old. He was just beginning. But his music lives on. Imagine is played at peace rallies and presidential inaugurations. In My Life is sung at weddings. Strawberry Fields Forever drifts through college dorm rooms. The Beatles catalog, those songs John wrote with Paul in tiny flats and Hamburg bars, still sells millions. Every generation discovers them anew. Maybe you remember the first time you heard "I Want to Hold Your Hand" on a crackling AM radio. Maybe you stayed up late to watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, your parents shaking their heads at those long-haired boys from England. Maybe Imagine played at your wedding or at a funeral or on the car radio during a long drive when you needed something to believe. John Lennon gave us the soundtrack to our lives. He gave us joy and rebellion and hope. But what did he get in return? Fame that never let him breathe, a childhood stolen by loss, a love the world couldn't accept, a life cut short by a stranger's bullet. In the end, John Lennon wasn't just a Beatle or a rock star or a peace activist. He was a deeply flawed man who spent his whole life searching for something he could never quite name. Maybe it was his mother's love. Maybe it was inner peace. Maybe it was just the chance to be ordinary, to bake bread and watch his son grow up without the weight of the world on his shoulders. He never got that chance. But he gave us Imagine. And in that song, in those 3 minutes and 3 seconds, John Lennon left us a gift, the dream of a better world, a world without violence, without hatred, without the kind of madness that took his life. We haven't reached that world yet, but every time we listen to Imagine, every time we close our eyes and picture it, a world at peace, we get a little closer. Rest in peace, John Winston Lennon. You imagined, you tried, and we'll never forget. Before we close, a brief note. This story is based on publicly available information, interviews, biographies, and historical records. Some conversations and small details have been dramatized to bring John's journey to life, but the heart of his story, his talent, his struggles, his dreams, and his tragic end is real. If this story brought back memories, if John's voice was part of your life the way it was part of mine, consider subscribing to Story Factory. We're here to revisit the legends who lit up our younger days, to remember not just their fame, but their humanity, because every legend has a story, and every story deserves to be told with respect. Thank you for listening. Until next time. Hill